Aeneas Tacticus here. Today I'm going to be discussing how historically accurate the weapons and armor in Assassin's Creed Origins are. Now, this game made a really big deal about how historically accurate it was as a portrayal of the ancient world, so that's why I'm going to be kind of critical, and I'm really going to point out what is and what isn't historically accurate. And since this game has so much in it, I'm going to start with just the Greek or Hellenic, you could say, soldiers that appear. Alright, let's get things started off with the first real enemy encounter in the game there. So I'm going to be examining all the parts of this guy's equipment, from the helmet down to, his boots basically. So let's take a closer look at the helmet. So we're going to start with this guy's helmet, called a Corinthian style helmet, and it's actually found on a lot of enemies in the game, officers, bandits, that kind of thing. Heavies, and this is a ancient Greek helmet, but it's from a totally wrong time period. This helmet is from the 5th century BC when it was worn, kind of into the 4th century BC. This game takes place in the 1st century BC, so you've got a difference of hundreds of years there. It's kind of like a movie set in the Iraq War with guys with tricorn hats because, they're American soldiers. So, yeah, not exactly the most historically accurate helmet for these guys to be wearing, although it's not a fantasy helmet. So if we look at some of the regular guards in the game, they're actually wearing much more appropriate style helmets. Now, helmets by this point had kind of gone through many, many hundreds of years of evolution. Instead of these closed-in Corinthian helmets made out of solid piece of bronze, for hundreds of years now, actually, Hellenic Greek troops had been moving towards more open helmets. Helmets that kind of had your whole face visible with cheek pieces. They were much cheaper to make. Instead of, the Corinthian helmet was made out of a single piece of bronze, and it was actually pretty difficult to make one. These helmets are a much more simple design to manufacture. You can manufacture them in bulk to outfit your whole army. And, I think there's kind of aesthetically, there's some cool stuff going on. I can see why they decided to go with the Corinthian helmets in the game. They're just this cool, classic looking Greek helmet. But that being said, they're just not really appropriate for the time period. They're like tricorn hats in the Iraq War or something. Now let's get into the kind of shield this guy is using. Now this is an ancient Greek / Macedonian shield. It's called a pelta, which just means light shield. And they really were this small, about 64 centimeters in diameter, or 8 palms if you want to use the ancient method measurements. Now these shields were designed for one thing specifically, and that was to be used by phalangelites or pikemen. Basically, you needed one hand free to hold the pike, so your shield couldn't be large enough that it covered your whole arm, including your hand, basically. Now, the only kind of troops who would be using these shields are pikemen. Their whole design, being strapped onto the arm, is to enable you to use your spear with both hands. Now, by this point in time, the Ptolemies were not using pikemen. Nobody was. They had last been used decades earlier, and they stopped being used then. So yeah, kind of, again, it's like out-of-date equipment. This case, it's a little less severe, but it'd be kind of like a World War II soldier in a movie about the Iraq War, just kind of outdated equipment at that point. So now let's get into the body armor. Now those arm guards, shoulder armor, that's totally made up, didn't really exist in the ancient world. His cuirass itself looks to be made out of either some kind of metal or leather maybe. Anyways, what it kind of looked like to me a bit is this piece of ceremonial iron armor recovered from a tomb in Macedonia. Basically, they actually believe this was a ceremonial piece of armor because the design would be kind of non-functional made out of metal. This kind of armor is actually usually made out of fabric, linen, mainly they think. Possibly some were made out of leather, but linen is really the scholarly consensus. There's a whole book about it I can link you to if you're interested discussing this armor. But yeah, this was a pretty flexible armor, flexible linen armor, and we know that because we have all these images of people putting on this armor, and it's bending all over the place. And we also have significant references in the literature of linen armor. So yeah, probably linen. What's shown in the video game is kind of this stylized look for that character. So I wanted to talk about this heavy guy's armor right at the end here. Interestingly, there's no back to his armor. Now, there is actually historical precedent for this, interestingly enough. Now, this bronze muscle armor, this was, armor for the wealthy guys. You had to be wealthy to afford it. But actually, we have references in history of Alexander the Great and stuff, and some other stuff, the Amphipolis Decree of this armor only there could be a back and a front, or just the front being worn, called a hemithorax in that case. And Alexander, for example, did that to one of his units, made them only wear the front piece of the armor so that they wouldn't run away in battle because their backs would be unprotected. Alright, now let's talk about some of the officers that you see in this game, and they seem to be kind of wearing the same kind of getup for the most part. So let's start with their chest armor here. Here's a good snapshot where you can really see this armor. It looks to be, again to me, that armor from before, what's called a linothorax or linen armor. In this case, though, it looks like they've gone for a kind of leather look, rather. Now, this armor could well have been made out of leather. Most of the evidence points to linen. But I just wanted to show some ancient images. This armor could often be really ornate and decorated. This is actually an Etruscan tomb painting anyways, but you can see that this armor had a lot of intricate designs on it in many cases. Here's an example from a tomb in Macedonia, just a different variation of the armor, and you can actually see those kind of cloth ties that guide around his chest. That's on the armor, but this one had, a shorter chest segment and more of those tarugas, as they're called, but the kind of skirts of the armor. Here's another Macedonian tomb painting. This time you can see how colorful the armor could be. These guys are decked out in purple armor. Looks a little bit out there, huh? But anyways, you might be wondering how effective this armor actually was. Well, modern research suggests that it could actually withstand arrows really well, slashing blows. It would take a really determined spear thrust. And this last picture of the armor is a famous mosaic of Alexander the Great. Here again you can see the ornate designs that this armor often had. Back to the picture of the officer again, I just wanted to focus on three things: the helmet, the arm armor, and that cloth band tied around his chest. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but that cloth tied around his chest was kind of the ancient Greek sign of an officer. Now on to the helmet. The helmet that they have in the game is kind of a fantasy-inspired design. It kind of looks almost like an a Roman imperial Gallic helmet with the cheek pieces fused together or something. Here I've got a picture of a historical example of a helmet that looks kind of similar, would be more suitable. It's a Thracian-style helmet, and it has this cool face protection in the shape of a beard. I just think that's an awesome-looking helmet. It'd be kind of cool to see that in the game instead of the fantasy helmet. Here, I just wanted to zoom in on some arm armor. So the arm armor the guy's wearing in the game did exist in the ancient world, but it was mainly limited to cataphract heavy cavalry, not really used by the Egyptians at this time, but it did exist at that time. So now I'm going to be discussing these two guards, mainly their helmets, but also the guy on the right has this kind of strange disc-shaped metal plate strapped to his chest, if you can see that. So we'll look at both of those in detail. So the helmets they're wearing, actually it looked to me like Celtic helmets. The cheek pieces look really similar. It's kind of odd that these Greek type guards would be wearing Celtic helmets. Now the Ptolemies did hire a lot of Galatian mercenaries who were Celts who settled in what's now Turkey. However, these guards are pretty clearly not Galatians just by their dress. They look, Greek inspired, but they're wearing these kind of Celtic helmets with the Celtic cheek pieces, Celtic style. This kind of helmet would be called the Montefortino helmet. The Romans would actually copy it, but the Greeks wouldn't. Now, the guy on the right was wearing this kind of chest piece, which kind of reminded me of these triple disc, that's what they're called, armor that were pretty popular in Italy a couple hundred years before this game takes place. Not really worn at this point in history. And it looks really similar to how ancient Iberian warriors are often portrayed, but I've only been able to find one reference to an armor like this, which is in on an ancient Iberian statue. But again, that's not really a Greek piece of armor. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the large amount of archers in this game, and also horse archers. Now, archers in this time period, and especially horse archers, were a real specialist troop type. They actually made up a pretty small percentage of the overall forces. Most of the archers would actually be from the island of Crete. Additionally, I don't think the Ptolemies in Egypt had access to any horse archers either. So a lot of the guards in this game are kind of equipped like pikemen, even though their spears aren't really long enough to be pikes, but I'm pretty sure that's what they're meant to be, especially since they're using the pelta, and they're using the spears with both hands both times. But by this time, pikemen were not being used at all. This is actually a mosaic from Egypt depicting the kind of troops they were using, and all these troops would be using kind of a regular spear or even javelins and sword with this oval shield called the thureos. Now, the thureos shield was first introduced to the Greeks in the 3rd century BC by a large Celtic invasion. One group of this large Celtic invasion would settle in what's modern-day Turkey, or they would call it Asia Minor, but they introduced this oval shield, and it became really popular pretty fast, and it was kind of the go-to shield if you were a mercenary from the 3rd century to the current time period. For a lot of the time they supplemented the pikemen, but by this time, pikemen weren't being used. The last time pikemen were used was in the Mithridatic wars. Well, the first Mithridatic war. After that, Mithridates stopped using them. So just to clarify, Mithridates was not an Egyptian or Ptolemy or anything. He was the king of Pontus on the Black Sea. But yeah, he only used them. He was the last guy to use them. He only used them in one of the several wars he fought with the Romans. He ended up training his troops in the Roman style with basically Romans who joined his army to train up his guys. And actually, the Ptolemies were doing the same thing with their army. They didn't really have, guys to serve in their phalanx anymore, and they just stopped using it anyways. They used these mercenaries, and they did get their own Roman centurions to train these guys up in the Roman style once the Romans started getting meddling in Egypt, you could say. But yeah, this is what most of the guys you fight in Assassin's Creed Origins should look like. They should have the oval thureos shield, a variety of armors, but yeah, not really the types of guys that we're seeing in the game. And I should also add a lot of guys in this game, and also available are these large two-handed weapons. These weren't used in the ancient world at all, really. The only example of a two-handed, like, sword-type weapon or something is the Rumpfea, which is like a two-handed sword used by the Thracians, but there weren't any two-handed hammers. There are a lot of two-handed, like, spear-type things, but no two-handed hammers or anything like that, because there just wasn't they didn't really need to break through a lot of armor, which was why those kind of things were invented. Alright guys, that's it. Thanks for listening. Hope this wasn't too boring. See ya.